and how you can best interact with us while we're talking.
Thanks, Jude. I guess, to introduce myself, I'm James Sparks, Global Education Cluster, sitting here in Geneva. And I'd also like to thank Lauren Burns, who's done an awful lot of work to help support getting this webinar up and running. I'm just going to run through a few of the features of Skype for Business. It shouldn't, I hope, be too unfamiliar from a normal Skype window. Just a point of information for transparency. We are recording this webinar, and we will be putting it up on our website later. We will edit it, obviously, before we do that, but just to let folks know. So in terms of the Skype for Business front panel, just to flag, we are muting everyone for the moment, and we have turned off video. We see how we'll go with that. We might unmute and ask for a few comments and questions, but for the most part, we're going to be using the chat menu to ask you to put questions and points to the presenter. The chat menu, if you look onto the left-hand side of the screen, is that little speech bubble similar to what you'll see in Skype. You can click that to turn it on. If this makes the presentation a bit small, you can click on the cross just to the right of where it says conversation to close the chat window. Not the cross in the top corner of the screen, that will shut the whole thing down, just the one in the chat window next to the word conversation. Probably the best way to view the webinar, if you're using via the web, is to go up to the right-hand side and hover. There's a little sort of picture of a silhouette of a person with an arrow, and it says pick a layout if you hover over that. If you pick presentation view, that should maximize the view of the presentation on the screen. If you're using Skype for Business desktop app, there's a couple of arrows at the top of the screen pointing diagonally. If you click on that, that will give you full screen. You can press escape to remove yourself from full screen. Full screen mode is, again, very useful for seeing the largest size of the presentation. Just a couple of other things. There is also a participants list at the top there. If you click on the little set of folks to the left of participants, that will show you a list of who's on. And finally, we are going to ask some questions. There are a couple of quizzes in the presentation. So again, we will use the chat initially for that. So just to help out, if we might ask things like, do you agree or disagree with this statement? So, you know, if you can say yes, no, somewhat, a little, that sort of answer. We have some questions where we'll ask you to pick an option, so you can just type in I agree with option 3 or 5. And then we've got a couple of ones where we ask questions like pull 3 items of data from the statement you see on the screen, and then just type the items of data into the chat as you get them. And that will give us an idea also about whether we're, you know, how well the material is coming across to you. You can also use the emoticons if you like for smiley faces or sad faces, and please also flag, you know, not understanding as well. Finally, on the technical side, if you're not hearing, we're talking too quietly, or there's technical issue, again, just type it in the chat window, and I'll see. I'm the tech support for today. I'll see what I can do to sort that out. We might just ask Rolf to speak up or quieten down a little, depending. He gets very enthusiastic. So that's the kind of quick overview of the interface from me. As I said, any questions, please feel free to use the Skype chat, and I'll try and use that to answer them as well. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Jude, who's just going to go through the webinar objectives, and then we'll be on to Rolf.
Thanks, James. I think we should give this a test. Can you let us know in the chat function if you're able to hear us okay? You can give us a yes or a little smiley face or a sad face if you can't hear us. Let us know. Great. Lauren's happy and she can hear. David, thank you. Thanks, Lisa. Fernando, this is great. Everyone seems to be able to hear us. Great. Welcome, all of you. So far, so good. Okay. So we're well aware that it's difficult sometimes when you're doing a webinar to really interact, but hopefully if we use this a little bit, it will help us to gauge how things are going. So that's great. In terms of the aims of this workshop, obviously we're looking at secondary data. By the end of this, and with the opportunity to ask questions as well, we're going to share some techniques to help you assess the validity and the reliability of secondary data. We'll outline some tips and tools that ACAPS has been using for collecting, processing, synthesizing and analyzing secondary data so that you can really kind of get the meaning from it. And then we'll turn to focus a little bit on specifically the HNO and your contribution to that. So this is what Rolf is going to cover. The presentation will probably take about 45-50 minutes, after which we'll have some time for questions. So are there any questions before we get started? Is this what you were hoping to hear? James has a question.
Yeah, just to flag, we have asked Rolf to put a few breaks in the webinar as well. So there will be options to ask questions throughout. And we also will give the opportunity for the 2 weeks after the webinar for you to send in questions and examples and things for us to help you with. And I'll talk a bit more about that at the end of the webinar. So the webinar isn't just about what we do today. There's also a couple of weeks at the other end that we'll make available to follow up on questions and things as you attempt the HNO process or secondary data reviews in country.
Okay, what to do? All right, Bernard, I'm sorry you can't hear. I'm going to let James try and sort that out with you while we get started. I wonder if it's maybe something on your laptop. Thanks. All right, so we're going to get going. I'm going to hand over to Rolf. Rolf, it would be fantastic if you could just briefly introduce yourself so everyone knows who you are and then take us through the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jude, and hello, everyone. My name is Rolf Bakken. I'm from Norway. I work as a humanitarian consultant and have done many jobs for ACAPS, both on developing methodology and also being deployed to the field on several occasions. This session it will be split into two parts. First, we will go through some general principles of secondary data review on data processing and on analysis. Towards the end, we will turn it into a more specific discussion on the humanitarian needs overview. As Jude and James have said, we will also have a couple of exercises for you as we go along. And thought we'll start right away with one. How would you define secondary data? You don't have to write a big definition on it, but if you can write some key words in the chat for the next 30 seconds, and Jude will read them back to us.
Okay, so we're seeing here that we're saying that it's based on research. It's not primary data, so that's correct. But Jean, how would you define primary and secondary data? Ellen's saying that it's existing data, but something that you're not collecting yourself. So it's something about it being indirectly collected is the definition there of secondary data.
That is true, and I'll just pull up a definition here. This is a definition that we have used, and you can just spend some seconds reading it so that we are on the same page throughout this session. Secondary data review is not a new way of collecting information, really. It's just that after we started using internet, that it has given us new possibilities and a rethinking of how to do it. The principles we apply for secondary data review, they are not that unique for the humanitarian community either. Every intelligence agency or media house, they usually have staff that is dedicated to desktop research and search for information from a variety of sources just by sitting behind their desk. It's only the purpose for which we search for information that changes, but the methods, they are quite similar actually. Most of you have probably worked with secondary data at one time or another, and you probably know that how we categorize data in these 4 pieces of jigsaw puzzle. In the assessment community of practice, we have been focusing on a variety of training, capacity development effort over the last 5 years, all focusing on how important it is to collect data for a defined purpose by using secondary data. But there's still a long way to go, we feel. Based on the recent experiences in the 2-3 first of the earthquake in Nepal, it was like a humanitarian assessment reflex kicked in, and a lot of humanitarian actors, they rushed to the field to see what was going on with their own eyes, instead of just sitting back and think through the whys, the whats, and the hows of an operational picture. Let's continue on by looking at some key principles for secondary data review. And these principles, they will apply to almost all situations where we do desktop research. First of all, you need to be prepared. It is said that no plan survives contact reality, but still, it cannot be emphasized enough how important it is to go through a planning process. If you have thought through before a crisis strikes how you will do a secondary data review, what tools you will use to process the data, what sources you could access, how the analysis process will be, what templates you will use, it will be so much more efficient when you do a secondary data review. You shouldn't wait until the last minute to make your preparations. And hand in hand with that is to have dedicated staff to work as analysts who has as their full-time job to collect and process needs-based information. Now, having said that, we understand and appreciate that not everyone has the capacity to have someone working permanently as analysts. But for the best possible result, and as a minimum, you should dedicate enough time to collect and process secondary data on a regular basis. Next principle, know what you need to know. There is a lot of information available out there, a lot more than we need. And before you start, you need to set the parameters and create a framework for your secondary data collection. You need to define what sectors you're searching for information in, what geographical areas are you focusing on, what time frame are you using, and you need to define what your information need is, what you're looking for, and then collect only what you can use. You should always balance the importance of the data versus the time it takes to find it and go through it. Next one, you should judge your data. This is perhaps one of the most difficult areas of a secondary data review. How solid is the information you have found? Is it biased? Is it just well presented but still just polished propaganda? Or is it something that you can actually use and trust? And many times the quality of the data is closely connected with how much trust we have in the source. We're going to take a pause a bit there and look closer at how we can judge the quality of sources and the data. When we collect and process secondary data, it will help the process if you have a system for coding how reliable you think the source is. This is one example of the type of reliability coding that is related to the source. I assume many of you have seen something similar, or perhaps you operate with something similar. Whatever system you use, and regardless of how you code these things, the only important thing is that you should use it consistently. A system like this, it works best when you know the context well and also all the sources. However, when you first arrive in a new context or are faced with a new source, you actually need to do some research on the source itself. You need to speak with local staff or other people you know who know the context and can give you a good feel for how a source should be judged. For example, media sources. You do not always know them because they can be national and you haven't read or seen them before. But if you dig a bit deeper, you can find a track record for accuracy and possible motive for bias, and a lot of people will actually know if they have any particular affiliations or anything. We're going to do a little exercise on how we judge data and sources. But first, let us hear some examples from the participants. How do you decide whether a piece of data is useful? You can just
Rolf, are you there?
I am here. I am here.
I think we didn't quite catch the question. You cut out there for a second.
Okay, sorry about that. Before we go through it, I'd just like to hear some examples from the participants. How do they decide whether a piece of data is useful? And I asked if they could just write a couple of keywords on that in the chat, and if perhaps you could read it out.
Not hearing me. Okay, so we've got a few responses coming in. People are saying that it should be relevant. They want it disaggregated.
Yeah.
And you're saying previous experience with the source. So this is if you know something about it that indicates that it is reliable.
All good.
Just
Very well.
Give it another minute. Okay, we'll pick these up. How does that sound, Rolf?
Sounds very good, and I picked up on the first one you mentioned about relevance. We can also evaluate data in a more structured way by using a simple checklist like this. First, we can ask ourselves if we find the information useful. Is it relevant? Is it important? And is it complete? And then we can cross it off as not usable or unusable before we move on. Let's look at an example. If you read through this piece of data and answer in the chat whether you find it usable or not usable.
So folks, when you've had a chance to read it, please vote if you think you would count this as usable or not usable data.
You can sit on the fence if you like and say possibly if you're not feeling brave, but try and be brave. Give us a yes or no.
Great, Fernando's gone right in there.
Yeah, usable but needs further probing. Yeah, there are some general complete. Ellen?
I'm just going to also kind of go back to some of the answers from before. Rolf, we had someone mentioning when we were talking about judging reliability, someone was also saying it would also, whether or not the information matches other information, so triangulating the data as well.
Exactly, and this is why this is absolutely usable. It's a lessons learned, and it can be used to anticipate a chain of events and what to avoid if a cyclone or other disaster strikes Myanmar again. So it's a very good example of what we can of a piece of data that can be used for triangulation.
Great. Okay, so we've had some responses coming in. Lisa's sort of saying no because it's too old. It's 5 years of lessons learned, so it's out of date. So general consensus that it's sort of maybe usable but not complete, and maybe out of date.
Yes,
Over to you,
exactly,
Ross.
and it should exactly, and then that's why I should put in the box for lessons learned that we can use to compare with to anticipate what may happen. Okay, but let's move on to our next question on our checklist. That goes to the source, the reliability of the sources. This is where you sometimes need to dig deeper before ranking it. You ask yourself, is it qualified? Does it have a good reputation? Does it have a motive for bias? And then you put in if it's reliable, fairly reliable, or usually reliable. Let's take an example again. Read through the text and then answer in the chat how you would rank this source according to the scale. And as James said, it's allowed to sit on the fence and not answer.
I must warn you, James is threatening to pick on some of the quieter members of the webinar.
I'm especially looking forward to seeing what David has to say about this particular one. The sources at the bottom. Yeah, Benoit, if you go to presentation view, that should remove the little blue people if they're covering the source. The source is Voice of America.
I think Benoit was responding to Fernando's point. The sources within. Okay, let's have a few. Okay, so people are essentially saying that, there is some bias there, it's a political source, but if it was triangulated with others, it might be of use.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. Ross, I think so. People are sort of saying that they would triangulate. Some are and aren't, depending on the individual, whether or not they feel comfortable with Voice of America as a source. But people are saying that some people are saying they might just use it but triangulate it with others.
Yes.
How would you categorize this?
Yes, I would agree with all of the above in a way. The information looks good. The facts of the quote can easily be checked with other sources. That's the thing. They have actually done some research themselves before they put out this one. But looking to the reliability of the source, I would put it as fairly reliable. There's a motive for bias, and it has a tainted reputation, which draws it down on the scale. But the information can be used for triangulation. Absolutely, that's also where I would put it. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Even if the source usually is trustworthy, we should always question the methodology that has been used. Almost all information is based on some sort of data collection. It can be interviews with key informants or detailed household surveys. But if the assessment methodology is not stated or explained thoroughly enough, it's often impossible to judge the quality of the data. And regardless of the reputation of the source, sometimes this makes the data almost useless. Let's take an example and see what you think about that. Read through this text and then answer in the chat how you would judge the methodology behind this information according to the scale on the top.
Okay, folks. So this is an education question. Education. So I'm looking for my education folks from Ukraine and from Sierra Leone to come in on this one. How do you think? Good quality, low quality? It's a pretty empty chat box at the minute.
Okay, I can reveal at least my one for it if it's.
Maybe Rolf, maybe people are just having a bit of a think, so let's just give them a few seconds just to chew it over and commit to something.
Yep.
Okay, so Benoit's put teachers up. So yeah, in a way, there's a bit of the puzzle missing. We don't know the status of teachers. The source is an interagency mission. But we're not quite sure. I guess we could try and find out who that was. It doesn't say who the agencies are. It could be 2, it could be 10. If communities could not provide details, it is suspect that education is claiming all community members. Yes, it's a bit. I mean, maybe they only asked 3 people, and then they said that's all. Or maybe they asked 1 person who said yes. Everyone says this. And so, yeah, that's Lisa flagging from her point of view. Then, therefore, we're not really sure the extent of the methodology, who was consulted. So it's a bit maybe low dependability. So a couple more coming in there. Yeah, not clear on the big question then on who was actually asked the questions. And then with the political status, of course, you know, that could influence the answers again if it was a government official compared to an individual in a school. Okay, Rob, back to you.
Thank you. And I again, you have picked up on the same things as I did. I would be very tough on this. Assessed. Well, that could be anything from a flyover to proper research. They've probably been on the ground, but still. Also, the methodology is not described well enough. Nothing is said whether it's key informant interviews, focus groups, or community group discussions, or anything. And also, it's the analysis of it is a mix between needs and recommended response, which makes the whole picture a bit blurry to me. So I would put this down on low quality, just to be, and I would also encourage everyone to be very critiqueful against methodologies, because that will actually help us all to become better in describing our methodology.
Yeah, and Rolf, from some of the more sort of responses coming in, people are definitely being quite critical of this, and they've got a lot of questions about it at least. So I think that's the way that people seem to be thinking. That's good. There's also a reason why I put this example up, so you can actually pick up on those things. Good. One thing we should be aware of before leaving this topic is that when we are not the only ones doing secondary data review, and a lot of the info we find are actually recycled ones of several times already. When preparing for this webinar, I had some of the education cluster secondary data review from before, and I recognized a piece of data that came from an assessment that I myself was involved in the coordination of. And I knew, saw the source, and I realized that it had been recycled 2 times. So sometimes when we find a source, a good piece of data, we go to the source. We should, if our radar is up, perhaps go 1 step deeper and see if this is actually just secondary data that is based on something else. Just as a metaphor, you've probably all been to Wikipedia at one point or another. And a lot of the information there is hyperlinked, or there's footnotes where you can go and see the actual source of that one, and then you can go beyond. Just so we don't take everything for granted. Any questions this far about judging data? You can write it into the chat. Rolf, I think we're going to just experiment and put everyone's microphones on and see if there's any questions. So
Well, yeah. Let's say this. Give us a smiley face if you've got a question to ask, and I'll unmute you and let you ask it direct to Rolf. And we'll just use this as a quick test for the tech. Or you can just type your question directly into chat as well if you'd rather not speak. That's fine too. I know some of you are on quite low bandwidths. So a smiley face if anyone wants to ask a question direct to Rolf. There will be further opportunities, or write a question into chat.
A few questions.
Okay, it tells us that people are typing.
Okay, so yeah, a comment about this process being quite time consuming. Rolf?
Yes, I can address that. It is very time consuming, and especially the first times you use it or do it. I think if you work regular with secondary data review or collection of secondary data and processing it, you'll become more fine-tuned to it, and you will do this almost as a second-hand nature. This is now I'm describing the structure of it. First, useful. Is it how is the source and how is the methodology? And these are questions that after we've done it a couple of times, it will become a habit to ask these questions in our minds.
Okay.
And I guess as well, you'll become familiar with the sources if you're in country. So rather than having to consider each time, you'll just know, all right, this is such and such a source, they're reliable, etc. And then just judging things like the quality, the questions that we just asked of this piece, they'll come to your mind very quickly, and you'll be able to make a pretty quick judgment on some of these. But yes, I think we tried this. We used this methodology for Typhoon Haiyan, and the first time we did it, it was we found ourselves with quite a few questions at the beginning, but by the time we'd done it for a couple of days, we were able to run through a lot quicker.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Well, Fernando's pointing out that there's sometimes there can be issues around data ownership.
Yes, I read it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's asking about data ownership, and I guess it goes to the confidentiality of it, how sensitive it is.
Okay, and so Jean is saying that they've stopped using the criteria. They've got so much that from a practical point of view, they're focusing now just on what, when, and who, and where. And perhaps that's something we'll touch on a little bit later. But any thoughts?
Yes, and then if you have 1,000 rows of data, you have gained the experience to take a couple of shortcuts every now and then. Then I'm quite sure that you know the sources. You do this even though you don't use the system, but I'm convinced that you have it in the back of your mind as a second-hand nature, that you do it subconsciously. When it comes to confidentiality, yes, there is a lot of data we cannot use. And when it comes to the confidential information, there is another system for that where we can perhaps use it as deep background. But this is something that you need to consider with the source of the information, but it's not covered in this webinar, unfortunately.
Okay, I'll scoop up any other questions as they come, Rolf, but let's continue for now, and if there's more questions we can take them.
Okay, we'll go back to visit our key principles again. The next one that we wanted to look at is figures. You should be cautious of them because most figures around are just rough estimates, and they're always a source of discussion. You probably experienced many of you, when you present or brief about assessments or analysis, This is where the discussion stops. This is where people start taking notes, and this is where they start to question everything. That's when you come to figures and numbers. Let's show you an example. Look at these two examples from Central African Republic and Syria. Just reflect for a moment what is striking with these two. You don't have to put anything in the chat, but just notice the difference. The one on the left-hand side from CAR is precise down to the one returned refugee. These numbers, they're clearly based on some sort of registration, but they don't really represent reality because it's so precise. It only shows who's been registered. And we all know from experience that there is a lot of refugees and migrants who are moving who is not part of a registration process. The one on the right-hand side is rounded, but it also clearly says that it's an estimate. But even if it's rounded, it's no more inaccurate than the registration figures. It's just that it shows a part of the reality, but both of these examples are just as inaccurate. The next principle we will cover is about comparability. When we bring data together from a wide variety of sources, comparability is usually very difficult. The assessments or the estimates, they are hardly ever harmonized. They may use different indicators, they may report on different admin levels, or they may use different definitions. For example, what do we mean by an affected? What precisely is a damaged house? Is the data collected at a household level, or is it collected at a municipality level? Do we really agree on what is baseline information? Media sources, they are often more inaccurate when they report from a location because they don't define what kind of administrative level they report on. Usually it's just on a national level, at best it's provincial. There's no easy way around this challenge of comparing data from different sources, but we need to take this into account when we categorize and store data. But we'll get back to that in a short while. The last one is that you should be aware of your gaps. There are two types of information gaps typical for secondary data review, and I'll show you an example of both of them. This word clouds on this slide, it reflects the secondary data that ACAPS collected in the first 6 months of the Syria crisis in 2012-2013. The information is tagged by geographic area and subject, including the sector, and the font size includes indicates the frequency. The question you ask yourself when we see this is, how could it be explained that there are almost no data on the Governorate of Quneitra, which is, has such a low font size you can hardly see it? Does this mean that there is no problems there, or is this just no reporting? The same is if you look at the sectors or the issues. There is hardly anything on education. But this doesn't mean that there's no problems or issues in the sector of education. It only means that this is what the sources have chosen to report on. It's the source that decide the frequency of reporting, and it's not by humanitarian needs. And this is a potential gap that we need to be aware of when we collect secondary data. The other gap is related to your defined information need. You have identified information need based on your objective, but you need to ask to what extent these are covered by the secondary data that is available. Even in the most information-rich of context, there will be some gaps. In many cases, you can get all the information you need through a secondary data review, but only if you accept that there will be some gaps, there will be some known unknowns, to call it that. And if you judge that that information gap is too big, it needs to be filled with primary data. Now, we have gone through these 7 principles of secondary data and talked about how we need to be prepared with templates, tools, and also have done some research into what sources that can be used. We have mentioned how it will be very beneficial to either have dedicated staff or make sure that at least secondary data is done on a regular basis. how we need to have a framework for our secondary data review and define what we need to collect and what not to look for. We also explored a bit how we can judge data and sources, and talked about how we should be cautious about figures, how difficult it is to ensure comparability, and how we, at the end of the day, need to acknowledge that the secondary data review comes with limitations of gaps. Before moving on to demonstrating how we can work with secondary data, is there any questions or comments at this stage? Jude and James, perhaps you can have a look at that, whether you can do it in a chat or whether you open microphones.
Thanks, Rolf. Yeah, I think as before, if anyone has a question they'd like to actually ask out loud, please indicate with a little smiley face and we'll open your mic, or you could feel free to keep asking in the text. You know, do these principles, are they very familiar, or is this just a decent reminder? Is there anything new there? As we wait for questions coming in, Rolf, Fernando had another point before mentioning that you need to include government in the loop with any data collection and distribution protocols, otherwise you can kind of compromise your efforts somewhat. That was relating to some of the previous slides. I think people prefer writing to you than talking to you, Rolf, I'm afraid.
Okay, sorry if I sound that intimidating.
Just give that a minute.
No, it's okay. It's often easier if you have low bandwidth to be understood through a text as well. Yes, it is true that you need to, sometimes you need to do it, but it also depends whether you're working, are you working for an NGO, and you depends on the context really. Sometimes you can actually report on a situation basing it on open sources. The government may not be happy about that, but it all depends on what kind of relationship you would like to have with the government of the country or in the context that you are working. It's this balance between being completely neutral and impartial and actually being practical and getting some work done as well.
Yeah, James here, just to come in on that a little, Rolf. You know, I think it's also, and you've actually got that on principle 3. Know what you need to know. Related to it, you know, what are you using this data for? If you're going to use this data, as we do often in the education cluster, to plan with government a response, then we need the government on board. They need to believe in the figures. If you're going to use this data for some kind of international advocacy or something, and you actually want to call government to account, you know, that's a totally different use for your data. And so the data that you're going to collect and the way that you do it might follow a different method. So within that, know what you need to know is very much linked to, you know, what you're going to use it for. And then, you know, how do you make sure that the people that are being targeted with your analysis will buy into the answers that you're given. And that will tell you who you need to include and how you need to make sure that when you put it across that people will accept your analysis.
Thanks, James. Rolf, there's people making a few comments here that are valid. Ben was mentioning that it's important to also capture information around invisible children and adolescents, I guess, particularly in a sort of education setting.
Mm-hmm.
Ellen's mentioning it's important that remember that not having data is also a piece of data. So knowing what your unknowns.
Mm-hmm.
Benoit mentioning that pre-crisis data can be useful, but it's not always available, and it's certainly not always disaggregated. So that can make it very sort of very. Any comment on that?
Sorry, Rolf. I just wanted to go back to Benoit's one. One thing that we've got to be a bit careful of on the education side is we often get figures from schools and school registrations, and then we're missing the data and the information about all the children that are not in school, and sometimes that information, you know, we're missing because we're very much focused on getting the information from the school level. So that's an important point from Benoit to highlight. Back to you, Rolf.
Yes, thank you. And I'll just go back to the last one, that secondary data review. It comes with gaps. It comes with limitations. There are just only that much you can find out with secondary data, and it's absolutely true that you need to also, when you have defined your information need, you also have made up an opinion about what is an acceptable uncertainty. And once you are finished with the secondary data review, you also know what the information gap is, and you can decide whether you need to fill this gap with primary data or if you can move on and report on what you got. Okay.
Great. Rolf, there's also a comment about sort of knowing who your audience is when you start work on your secondary data review. Know your role and know your audience.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You sometimes we can go back to this when we talk about the HNO, but there are certain reporting that goes up and there are certain reporting that goes down. That is more important for operational planning than strategic policy making, to put it like that.
And another issue, Sean, there's particular challenges in Sierra Leone where they're being asked to completely rely on government data for the education response, but then this data's not been updated in 3 years. So there's a sort of big gap and out of date information there. And there's also a conflict between the data at different levels, so they've got some challenges there.
Yeah, I see that one. That's obviously a lot of limitations, and sometimes our hands are in a way tied on our back. I wonder if we could just move on, or should we actually go into this country specific, or take them towards the end, James?
Well, maybe I'll just dive in with an answer to Shan, and then maybe let you move on. I mean, again, I think that goes back to working with government. I think your point near the beginning about having the methodology. So when we're quoting stuff in our secondary data and saying this is what we've got, if we're making clear, this has been from 3 years back, maybe we could even put in a little bit about what we think have been the trends over the last 3 years. I mean, sometimes you kind of have to get the real analysis a bit in by the back door. And that's a bit of the challenge when you're working with government that want to paint a particular view. But being clear about where the data has come from, and if there is differences between two data sources within the methodology, then allows people who are using it to sort of make their judgment. And as I said, you can sometimes put in the foreword or description of the methodology. Sometimes you know, in the last 3 years, we've seen, we expect to have seen, so people could sort of take a bit more information from it that way. But yeah, it is a challenge when we're told kind of what numbers we've got to write in our analysis. So back to you, Rolf. I think looking at the time, we should probably move on.
Yeah, it's one thing I sit here and speak about key principles, but sometimes principles is a luxury you can't afford, and especially in those situations that I mentioned in the chats now, when you are the sources you can use and what you can report with is imposed on you. So I'm speaking about the ideal world in a very general way. So, but I'll move on from this one, and you can perhaps take it up later. Now, bear in mind that a lot of secondary data we actually come across is qualitative. They may be quotes, they may be description, or they're just text describing figures. To make your analysis easier, you need to describe the data, but sorting it under a number of headlines or tags. Secondary data is all about tagging. There are online tools for it, but Excel is probably the simplest you can use and what most people around the world knows the basics of. And you can easily create a database which sorts and saves already processed information, in a way taking information and turning it back into data. Now, every piece of data we come across needs to be captured and stored in such a way that we can easily retrieve it when we start analyzing. Just look at this visual for a minute. Imagine the center of this visual is a piece of data. By tagging it, that is labeling it according to the sector or the issue or whatever other description you want to put on it, we can later use a filter function within Excel to look up the data in one or more areas and see how they compare. If you look at one of them in more close-up, I know this is a bit difficult for you to see, This is a tag that is named who, where you can describe what population group the piece of data pertain to. And when you analyze later, you can filter out all the data, for the group that you want to look closer at. This is another close-up of a geographical area. And if you tag it with the name of the area and also the place code, if you want to put it on a map, it will be easy to look up all the data from one area. For this to be useful, you need to collect and categorize data on a regular basis. The way we structure this information and set it up, it will ease the analysis process later on. Now, the guidelines for humanitarian needs overview, they recommend 9 categories that you should tag information with. These are these ones. They, however, they serve a very multi-sectoral purpose, but you would benefit from developing a sector and context-specific one. Now, I will do one of the things we have tried out when we tested this webinar now, which is to switch into Excel. So bear with me for a second while I try to share my desktop with you. Now you should be able to see an Excel sheet on the screen.
It is just loading, Rolf. I'd give it a second.
Okay, just let me know when you can see it.
Yeah. Okay, that looks like it's up at least for our screens. Might take a little bit longer if there's places with lower bandwidth. Mm-hmm. Can folks see that now? You should be able to see Rolf's screen. Great. People are smiling at us. This is nice. Thank you, Lisa.
That's nice. Thank you.
Great. Okay, carry on, Rolf.
Yes. This is a database that was made by ACAPS in the Syria crisis that we use. It covers 2 to 3 months from late 2013 and early 2014, and it contains around 1,100 rows of data, each of them describing one piece of data like this. You can see the blue headline up here is the tags that we have made on it. It doesn't follow any guidelines set out by Interagency Standing Committee, but it was the tags and the headlines that we wanted to classify it with. As you can see, we had the publication date of the information, the country or the name of the location, the sector or the issue, what kind of group it could pertain to, the information itself, source, type of source, but also the hyperlink, and we also had the rows for reliability, etc. Just to demonstrate, I know many of you probably have done this before, but I can just demonstrate how it works, because as I said, this contains now 1,100 rows. Let's say you just want to look at one country, focusing on Lebanon. Okay, I still have a lot of Lebanon. I just want to look at education. Look at that one. Then it's a lot less. Then I can look at this information together. I can compare it, and I can see if I can make some of it is comparable, so that I can actually perform some sort of analysis on the situation on education in Lebanon in this period that this information was collected. Some of the experiences we have made ourselves when working like this is that you should copy-paste as much as possible when this piece that I have in this cell is copied directly in. You shouldn't try to interpret it and try to change it, because that is what you do in the analysis when you interpret it. You should also provide a very clear definition of what should be in the various headlines. Like, for example, if you now we've looked at education, but you should have on your Excel sheet a dictionary describing what you mean by education, or what you mean by public sector, what you mean by access issues, so that you're all speaking the same language. I would recommend for a sector or a country that you make your own sector specific. I've spoken with many or some in the education sector for around the world, and I realized that a lot of you already do this. But I also realized that you are trying to develop a generic one from the global education cluster. I wonder if you could say a thing or two about that, James.
Thanks, Rolf. What we can also do is actually share the one that we started in the Philippines. At the moment, the basic template that we're looking at takes the INE minimum standard domains. So there's 4 domains there as the main category. And then we also have another thematic issue. We do have a little bit of a problem in that sometimes a piece of data will fall into 2 domains. I just wondered how you'd handle that on this. But we'll keep people up to date. There will be a listserv and we'll post it on the website. But we'll share alongside the one that you see on the screen, the one that we used from the Philippines, which was based on the INE minimum standards, which is, you know, and I know in some countries such as South Sudan, for example, they've contextualized the minimum standard. So again, the tagging could be based on that contextualized version. But yeah, we'll share that. But I mean, if we say had a set of thematic issues and we actually wanted to put 2 or 3 against a piece of data, Rolf, how would we do that within an Excel database that you're showing here?
Well, what I would do is to create more columns, a column per domain, and then you can filter it out. Now I filtered out Lebanon, education, and I can also continue to filter out refugees on the 2-1 on that one. But if you have sub domains and other domains and you wanted to see the combination of several, it's all about the filtering, how you do it. That will be my first suggestion. And the second one is what I already mentioned, that you need to have a very clear dictionary so everyone is speaking the same language, that you know what you mean when you tag something or put a description of a refugee in. Everyone knows that that is a person that's forced to leave his home and cross the border and not an IDP, just to take a very simple example.
Yeah, thanks, Rolf. And I mean, I think that's even going back to when we're doing primary data collection. I remember doing a questionnaire when you had to say, was a school partially damaged, totally damaged, severely damaged? And so be very clear on what fits into which category is essential for primary data. And I guess you need exactly the same for secondary data. If you're going to tag something as a psychosocial support issue, we need to know what that actually means, what it encompasses and what it doesn't encompass. Back to you, Rob.
Thanks for that.
About filtering, Fernando's asking, is that based on the 5 Ws?
No, this is based on the filtering. Let me see the question in myself. Not necessarily. It's based on what we as in ACAPS felt was the necessary filters to have for the products that we were issuing. We were publishing regular analyses of the Syrian humanitarian situation. And we have found it to be useful to have these headlines and these tags when we went into the analysis. I mentioned...
Sorry, just to dive in. So, I mean, the 5W, I guess it's more around the what. The where will be pretty much the same. You'll definitely have a when the information came from. You've got a whom, the group. But the 5W tends to say the what in terms of what activity are you doing. Here, the what is more around, you know, what's the issue? Is it a protection issue, a psychosocial support issue? So the what is different, and you can have a number of different ways of analysing that what, you know, depending on how you set your database up.
Yeah, and also just to also be very clear on one thing, this has all to do with needs. Nothing to do with response. Trying to keep needs analysis aside from response analysis. That's a very clear way. Although it's very easy to get muddled and let one influence the other the wrong way. Let's see if I can try the going back to the presentation again. Hang on a minute and bear with me.
Okay, Rolf, well, as you're doing that, just to answer again Fernando's question about generic template, Yeah, I think what we're going to try and do is put together a kind of generic template where you'll actually pick. So there might be 20 different issues in the template, but if you're doing one in a conflict situation, you might pick 10 of those which we use for tagging. In a natural hazard, there might be 12 that are relevant. So we'll try and get the kind of definitions and the generic one that covers all. But when you're actually doing your own, one, you'll probably pick a subset, and then you might need to nuance them depending on the situation that you're in. But what we're trying to do is come up with those categories and ways of framing it that are pretty standard across the board, and make it just easy to take a subset or just adjust slightly to give the final version that you'll use. I can see your presentation is back up, Rolf, so I'll hand back to you.
Thank you for bridging that little transfer. Let's try a little exercise on that. I'll give you a piece of information and you tell us through the chat how you will tag this. Look at this piece of information and tell us what categories you would attach to this piece of data. What I'd like you to do is name the headline or the tag that you will use and write them in the chat. Yeah. I can see things coming up in the chat, so they're all.
Yeah, so people are talking about naming naming it. They've got the date, what groups, sources.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let me go through them so I can see that we are on our last 30 minutes of the time. Date, correct. Source. Having the source, we can also say something about the reliability. I guess many of you have a relationship to UNICEF or already work with it and have a good feel for how reliable that is as a source. We have the sector or the issue, the education, obviously. The administrative level. On this one, it's just a country. We cannot go deeper than that. And we have the population group, which is both refugees but also children. I can see in the chat here that you also put in the learners. That is probably education-specific one, which is fine. I've just taken the one that I felt from a very generalist and multi-sectoral point of view. Let's take another one. Look at this piece of information and tell us what categories you could attach to this one. Write them in the chat and we'll go through them. Yep, I can see that it's coming up. It's not rocket science once you start to think like this. Exactly.
Okay. So people are coming up with different thoughts about what the where is. Go ahead, Rolf. How would you have categorized this?
Same as so I see in the chat. You have the date, you have the source. You can say something about the reliability. However, this is a media source. It is obviously local, so we need to have contextual information about this source, and we need to have researched it or been there so long that we actually know if this is a reliable source or something or not. Sector and the issue, displacement. We have admin levels in this case. We're both in the governorate of Quneitra, but we also have the villages of Al-Kiswa and Al-Fadel. Population groups, IDPs.
There's a suggestion here that you could actually tag that several times across several rows if there's been different geographical levels as there are here.
Yes, or you can have several filters. As in the, I will not go back to the Excel sheet now, but on that one we had country, and we also had further down on the administrative levels. So, but they were then just left open if the piece of information didn't give any further one.
Great.
Yeah. Okay. Next up is actually to have a short talk on analysis, if there's no more questions to how we actually can work with this, work with secondary data and use Excel as our tool.
Yeah, I think we'll push on, Rolf.
Yep, good. We'll not go deeply into the field of analysis, because that would be a series of webinars in itself, but we'd like to underline that analysis is not one action in itself. It's a process consisting of several steps, and the first is exactly what we've been through, where we have been categorizing and storing data in such a way that we can play with it to see what it means. This is the who, what, where, when, and how, where we ask ourselves those questions, and it summarizes what we know about the situation, what is worth noting, and we organize the data in a way that is easy to work with. Many reports or assessments products nowadays, they just put data together and report on them directly from that stage. They never ask the question, and so what? And they kind of leave the interpretation to the reader without explaining any further. We want to go a bit deeper. We want to explain why the situation is that it is. This type of analysis is often included in the strategic response plan to provide a rationale for the suggested response, but it may also be useful to actually have it already in the document or the report, focusing on the needs. The next level, that's where we ask what it means, and this is the level where we examine why a certain problem or a certain topic is more important than other. The last level, it looks to the future and asks what might happen next if the situation is allowed to continue without any interventions. We usually describe these levels as descriptive, explanatory, interpretive, and forecasting. What we can say as a good rule of thumb is that the individual analyst can do this by him or herself, but these levels on the top should preferably be done together with others. Several brains think better than one, and at the end of the day, the human brain is the best analytical tool we have. This concludes the general part of the session, and I can see that James has written in the chat that there will be an analysis webinar later in the series, so you'll most probably see this visual once more. If anyone of you wants to go further and read further, these are some of the further reading and tools that we'll come up with. And if you want a head start on developing your own tool, I would recommend the one on the top, where the annexes actually is a folder with tools, including Excel worksheet, with already have multi-sectoral tags that you can play around with by yourself. If we now look at the challenges with the humanitarian needs overview, these are some of the...
Sorry, could you just pop back and just run through what the other
of course,
other ones are?
Yeah. The other ones, they are technical briefs that talks about how you judge quality and usability of data that you are collected during a rapid needs assessment. It's called, with a catchy title, How Sure Are You? The second one is what we call Compared to What? That's how you approach analytical thinking and needs assessments. This is where you, it talks a bit on how you should, what kind of mindset you would have when you go into analysis. And the last one, it talks about qualitative and quantitative research techniques. They are not too technical, and they could be good if you are interested in reading more up on the topics that we have been touched upon during this webinar. I see Fernando asking a question. We do not have sector-specific reviews. We are working very much on a multi-sectoral level, but we do cooperate with sectors individually, just as we are doing now with the Global Education Cluster.
Thanks, Rolf.
Yeah. Okay, looking at the challenges that has come up with the humanitarian needs overview. Before, when preparing for this webinar, I conducted a number of interviews, both with Global Education Cluster coordinators, but also with people from OCHA and my own colleagues within ACAPS, who have been tasked to pull together multi-sectoral needs assessments based on secondary data review. Now, I'll go through them because I've summarized them, but while I talk, just please use the chat field to communicate if these challenges resonate with you. You can also just use the emoticons to convey your thoughts and feelings on this if you like. The challenges that many felt with working with OCHA, reporting through OCHA, is that they many times had short or impossible deadlines without specific or without any flexibility. Some of the tools from OCHA, they came with bugs that were difficult to clean up on. They were just too complicated. And many also asked what the added value of a humanitarian needs overview was for the sector and what they got in return. Sometimes they felt that there wasn't any added value to it. And the ultimate question, what to include, what not to include, because many times we found it shortened by OCHA, and it was often confusing to know what you were going to include and not. The challenges with the partners within the sector or within the cluster was that some of them didn't necessarily see the link with between the humanitarian needs overview and operational planning or concrete funding. The data that they forwarded to the cluster coordinator is that it was sometimes flawed, incomplete, or out data. Other sectors that they cooperated with often show the lack of interest in emergencies in education. Sometimes there was some mention actually that there was a conflict of interest and almost a competition between sectors that had led them to believe or suspect that someone tried to interpret findings in a way that led to better funding for their own sector. And others also mentioned that data from other sectors were incomplete, and that influences the education cluster since they were so dependent on good data in all sectors to get a complete picture. And then internally, challenges with having few resources on the analysis side. Very difficult to compare data, secondary data, because they were often inconsistent. And there was often a lack of granular or disaggregated data. If you looked at the...
There's a couple of other comments just that people are saying that that they're not aware, at least, of any guidance that's specific for the clusters. It's mainly for OCHA, and that there's sometimes the data can be so big that it confuses the user. As well as general kind of issues around capacity. So yeah, carry on. Sorry.
No, it's as I see them myself, and I'll comment on at least one of them in just a bit. If you looked at the challenges from a multi-sectoral level, from those who were pulling them together, some of them were remarkably alike with the cluster or sector coordinator. They were sometimes experienced as a lack of interest in the HNO and the added value of presenting overall needs. It's like it said in the chat there, that at times the data is too big, that it confuses the user and they will lack interest in the process. Sometimes the process becomes more important than the product. On clarity regarding the process has sometimes led to that the discussion has been stopped or it's been derailed and you're not longer focusing on the data. The person I spoke with there talked about that the deadlines of when to submit things needs to be clear, and also the window of opportunity for commentary, which comment will be processed when, and also when and by whom that has the final sign-off on the document. Not in time, not in format, and also don't follow guidelines. There's many have actually experienced that there was this last minute scrambling to forward data or products, which of course led to that the quality not being of the necessary quality that they felt they would need. Data had not been collected regularly throughout the year and processed. It was not prepared, and many said that you shouldn't wait for someone to take the initiative for the HNO when you know that it's actually coming, that you should do this regularly. And also, a lot of data was unclean. To work with data and databases, one needs to have a bit of an obsessive-compulsive disorder almost. You need to be very serious about it, and you need to clean it regularly so that you are able to share it and not necessarily only share the PDF copy, which is very difficult to work with. Needs versus response. That is something, sometimes it muddles the picture a bit. We focus on needs, and a humanitarian needs overview should be a needs overview, not a strategic response plan. It's very important actually to have these two things apart. And the final one, which was the same when from the sector coordinator's point of view, there's a lack of granularity and disaggregation in the data that was forwarded. Now, just to for the record, this is not the challenges relating particularly to the education cluster or to a particular context or country, but this is a summary of what people pulling together a multi-sectoral document have been experiences globally. But just out of curiosity, which one of these are the biggest challenge in your view? You can write a number in the chat, and then we can just add up, number them from 1 to 7.
I'll just come in while people are voting on that one. Just to echo a couple of points made in the chat. I think our recommendation is definitely use the HNO as a process that's useful to your cluster. It's got to have something more than just feeding into the overall HNO, and making it useful in a number of other ways for your cluster will really help with the buy-in. The second one was it flies out of his head as soon as he starts to talk about it. Crikey.
The regular data collection.
I'll come back to that one.
Okay. We've got a few votes meanwhile coming in. Fernando's recognising that the data is not being collected regularly in some cases, and that's an issue. David's very clear that there's an issue there about unclean data versus the PDF copies, which makes it difficult, I guess, to start playing with it.
Mm.
It was on the needs response thing. It's important to note, and this is the push from within the guidance, that we should be trying to articulate the overall needs within the country. This is before we've decided what capacity we've got to respond to those needs. And that's the real underlying bit of the HNO that's a bit different from the old appeals process. The old appeals tried to sort of say, these are the needs we're going to address. The HNO should really articulate the humanitarian needs as known across the whole of the country or the affected area. And then it's within the HRP that you say, okay, well, this is the capacity we've got to respond, etc. So, really just to flag that, it's not exactly the point that you had in 6, but just to flag that that's really how the HNO has changed a bit from the CAP.
Yeah, and it's a recognition of the fact that it's so easy to present the need based on what you know that you have in your backpack to respond with. It's a kind of a bias that we can't get away from. So that's why it's important to define and analyze the needs first, even though we know that we can only respond to this and this and that. When doing this little survey or little key informant interview exercise I did over the last week, we also come up with a number of suggestions, and then go through them one by one now. If you have others, and I can see many of you have already started to put it into the chat, feel free to share it through the chat. I've just summarized this, what has come up through my little survey, but there may be other thoughts out there that are just as important or even more important. The one thing that people mentioned first was that one should engage in this dialogue on a country level very, very early on, to decide on the practicalities of the work, when to forward what to forward, etc., so that it doesn't come late and it's become this scrambling of data. The second one, that if resources allow, one should try to have dedicated analysts for data processing. Now, as we said when we went to the key principles, it is not always easy. It's a capacity and it's a resource question, but at least try to run an ongoing database for secondary data throughout the year. Do it on a daily basis, so it becomes almost a second-hand nature. This will help you once you're going to analyze the needs and present your input to the humanitarian needs overview. Yes, run an ongoing database for secondary data. You can keep it short and simple. Now we've already heard that a generic one will be shared from the global education cluster that you can play with. And there are many of you already running your own versions of it. This also came up to the chat I saw. This year there will be a new template out for the next humanitarian needs overview, and it's based on feedback from the users of the last 2 years. It is shorter and sharper, but the structure is still very, very strategic. It talks about big data. That is not so useful for your partners within the cluster and the organizations on the ground. So you should have your own operational part, as someone mentioned here. It's actually like you have two HNOs. One that you can goes up and one that goes down. These, however, should be linked together. In the annex, the operational annex for the in the overall H link for the one that is operational, in case donor wants to look at the details. Some donors are becoming more and more conscious about not only taking the big numbers, but also want to dig a bit deeper and check the methodology. And the last one, try to engage partners within the sector for a joint analysis. A joint analysis, even if it's structured, doesn't have to be very formal or done as a one-off thing. It doesn't have to be a big workshop. I can take the examples from the response we recently had to Nepal. During the first 3 weeks there in the assessment cell that was formed after a couple of days, we had daily joint analysis sessions where we invited just about everyone to come and take part in a discussion on what the needs, what the data we had up until then actually meant. Remember that 2 brains thinks better than 1, and the human brain is the best analytical tool we have. Yeah, see, many agree with my kiss here. Keep it short and simple. Keep it safe and simple, or short and simple.
Well, just in terms of timing, I think we're good for another 10 minutes or so. So keep going, Rolf. We're nearing the end now, and we've got a few bits and pieces we want to share at the end of this.
Yeah, I am actually at the end, and now is the only thing that is left is to introduce the homework, or if there's anything that needs to be discussed regarding the HNO.
Tell you what, Rolf, let's do the homework, and then we'll just in the last 5 minutes, if people want to stay on and ask questions, we can do that. But people who want to get off can. So let's look at that homework, and then we can open it for questions for people who still want to stick around for a few minutes.
Okay, I'll put up this one, James, and if you could introduce it.
Okay, so here is your, I won't say once in a lifetime offer, but it's certainly a novel offer for support. Rolf and the team here will be available for the next couple of weeks to give you support on your HNO. So you've got a number of options. One, take a country you're working in now. and actually go through the exercise of collecting data and then submit it into us. And it can either be, you can have a go at doing a database, you can have a go at doing a framework for reliability and evaluating the quality, or the analysis, or the group together. If you're actually working on HNOs, on databases and things in country for your job right now, then please submit those and we can give you feedback on those. If you're not actually sort of doing either of those, then there is the third option, which is a case study, which we'll present on the next slide. So if you actually just want to go through the academic exercise and get some feedback, we can do that as well. So we'll be available for the next 2 weeks, just on the admin side, everything to be sent in to me, James, and we'll share the email address for you. But you've got that opportunity now for us to give you some targeted support on your HNO work. I mean, if you are working in another sector, sure, we can have a look at that as well, if you like your HNO work as well. Okay.
Okay, I will then just present this case study on the next 2 and the last slides, and I can probably go back to this one if it's needed. The case study is to analyze what impact the Ebola outbreak has had in Sierra Leone for the education sector as of September 2015, which is today's date. You should use only secondary data sources. You should store the data in an Excel database, and you should limit your analysis to 1 page. Now, you need to find the data yourself, and you need also to create the database yourself. We will not give you any tools for this, but as you heard through this webinar, we would strongly recommend that you use Excel for this because it's easy to use. Just a couple of hints. Try to limit your search. Don't dig yourself down. The Ebola response and the Ebola leads, that was so much covered in international media and probably in local media as well, that there's bound to be a lot of information out there. When you come to the step where you analyze, try to go beyond just describing the data and explain what they mean. What is important by this, and why do you think it's important? Remember, your methodology will always be questions, so you need to have some references and some transparency, and that becomes more deeper when you draw the analysis. If you claim that something is important, then I, as a reader, I should have the opportunity to go back and double check it. This is the case study, but I can go back to the 2 slides, to the options.
Yeah, just to answer a couple of the questions. Yeah, we'll share the PowerPoint. We'll share the SDR that we used for the Philippines. We'll share the Syria example you've seen. And we'll share the HNO, the new HNO template. So those things will be available. And whilst the stuff will come in through me, most of the analysis will be done by Rolf. So don't worry about the technical expertise that will be applied to it.
Okay, so great. So just to clarify, you're welcome to send something that you're currently working on and get some feedback on that. It could be an actual database, it could be your sort of reliability framework, it could be some of the analysis you've actually done, or if you prefer to use the case study option that Rolf was just outlining there, you're very welcome to do that and do it as a whole exercise and get some feedback that way. And James has provided his email, so please do send it to him first and he'll send it out to us.
Yeah, we'll put the various information on the website. There's a post on the needs assessment webinars. We'll add the links to the various things there and put a quick explanation. So I think given the time, I mean, we'll just do the close up now, and then we'll just hang around for a couple of minutes if there's any final questions for people on. But we'll just do the close up for people that are leaving.
Great. All right, before everyone leaves, I'm just going to put in a link to a feedback survey. It really is very short, but it would be great if you could give us your thoughts, particularly on what you think worked, what we could do differently, and also any ideas you've got for next time. So as James said at the beginning, we're going to be doing a series of webinars, and it'd be great to help us formulate exactly what we will cover. We will be looking at analysis, but I think we can get a little bit more specific than that in some ways. So please send us your feedback. This recording itself will be available as well. If you know people who weren't able to join but would be interested in listening, obviously they can only interact in their heads with us, but they are able to take themselves through the entire webinar as it was. So thank you very much. Thanks in particular to Rolf for taking the time to put that all together and doing some interviews with so many people to get some thoughts on the H&O process. And thanks also to you, James.
Yeah, and I'd just like to thank ACAPS for their invaluable support, as always. It's a pleasure working with you. And thanks again to Lauren for really pushing this through and taking the lead on getting us up on the webinar platform. So we've got 5 more minutes. I'll just leave the floor open if anyone wants to take the opportunity for a last question to Rolf. And just to mention again that the information will all be available on the website. So any last questions or comments before we finish up? Or emoticons? They're sadly lacking in, I see about 3 or 4. Can we at least someone put a little animal up or something? Yeah, there was a question actually from Jean-Merge on OCHA, so we'll discuss that here. I think there really is, it's a bit of a bigger question about how we put in comments and suggestions to OCHA, more broadly from clusters to OCHA. So we'll try and find out where the people are within OCHA that we should focus questions around the H&O process too, and try and get an answer for that. But it is a bit bigger in terms of how the global clusters, various clusters, relate information into OCHA as a whole as to the process. Unfortunately, the meeting on the H&O and the HRP was actually yesterday, so we missed an opportunity there. But there will be another one, I think, in a couple of weeks. So that will be one avenue. Okay, I'm not seeing anything more on the chat, so I think we'll call it a day there. Thanks very much, Rolf. Hope all's well in Oslo. Thanks, folks, for joining us and stick with us through it. And please take time to give us your thoughts in the survey. It really will only take you 5 or 6 minutes on that.
Should I close?